Test. Okay. Well, I'm Andreas Kupries. I work for Active State, and I want to talk to you about the framework I wrote over the last 6 months roughly, which I call Cmdr, which helps me to design the commands and arguments and so on for command line application. Let's see, yeah. And basically, this is just the table of contents roughly what I will try to touch on. And the background is that in our Staccato private path system, we have a command line client, and it already had code, of course, to pass the command line and all that. However, we wanted to have nested commands and more features, and the existing code was beginning to creak, and so we decided to create something better. Famous last words. And at the beginning, I knew about the tickle, the get opt, and the command line stuff. However, these are more geared towards tickle procedures and not command line applications, which can be much more complicated with complex stuff like if you use this argument, then you can't use the option or options which exclude each other, things like that. Then the only other thing which might have been suitable, the TPAM in tickle, this is something I actually forgot when I started working on things, and later on, while writing this paper, I found about it and realized, yeah, that might have been also a good starting point, but well, it's not. And the architecture and all that is currently modeled on something called Mothership, which is a Ruby package actually. So, and I thought that it might be easier to show a few things in in a small demo. Let's see if I can do this. So, okay, I am now in the Staccato client. What you see here is the Staccato client using its own command line loop, which is based on line noise. I will talk about this a bit later, a bit more. Right now, I want to demonstrate more of a help system I currently have, which is basically, let's say, is that actually readable?
You make it larger?
It is the largest font I found for the command prompt. Okay, basically, sorry. So this is basically the full help. One part of Cmdr is a small domain-specific language to define the commands and the arguments we have, and part of it is then to have the descriptions together with the commands, so that whenever I change commands, I can immediately update the description and they are near to each other. And while I still have to write the descriptions, the moment it comes to the integrated help, it is all generated using these descriptions. And partially it is actually coded, like for example, the options which are defined as aliases of some other options, the description is auto-generated. And what you see here is the full format, and I also have something called short, which simply describes the command without going into the details of the options. And there's also something called a list, when you want to see just the listing of all commands, which is quite a bit here in the Staccato client. And these are the three predefined formats I have in the client. And not in the client, but in the Commander framework. The moment you use Commander, you have these three formats always. And however, it is also interesting. One of the non-standard commands formats I added is called JSON, which basically dumps the internal data structure about the command and its arguments in a form you can then feed into some external script, so that you can then use that to generate HTML help and stuff like that. And it also means the HTML help, the external documentation, is still generated from the definite source, the declaration of a command API, and there can't be transcription errors or stuff like that. And for giggles, I also had another non-standard format, which is SQL, which basically dumps, instead of JSON, it dumps the stuff as an SQL database schema and insert statements. And that is something which might be usable for a developer to basically to query the database and see if some type of argument is used in lots of commands or things like that. Then you have to basically try when you get some application and you have to start maintaining it, and you want to figure out what there is. And yeah, so getting back. So that is basically, in short, this page. And on the next page, this is something I had already showed a bit. Basically, I am currently here in a command line loop, not of command exe, but in a loop generated by Commander. For this, I use a C code which was originally written by Salvatore Sanfilippo, Andreas. He wrote Redis. That was a very that is called line noise, and it is basically a line editing library like edit line, read line, except it is a very, very small, and it has a very permissive license. And it wasn't quite what I needed. On the other hand, luckily, Steve Bennett, he who wrote Gymtickle, actually forked this and extended it so that it would be portable to Windows. And also added a few other stuff. And this is what I basically then wrote binding for, which is called tickle line noise, which uses critical, which was also bandied around already. And at that point, it was trivially easy to add this command line loop functionality into the framework. And this is something which is automatically generated. You declare your commands, and the framework takes care that there is a command loop you can use, and where it will then find, where you can enter all your commands as you need it, want them or need them. And as it is based on line noise, it also has simple command line completion facilities. Like, for example, I typed the A, and with a tab, it now cycles through all the commands I have. And in this case, let's say A minus. And now, then I have a command. I can see what options I have available on this on this position. And for example, you shouldn't actually see the debug option because it is marked as undocumented, but now that it is, you can then also command complete the possible values of the option, and then don't I have what we now see is debug output, but the debug stuff that is outside of the Commander framework and more staccato. And one of the interesting things is, this is now what I call the main command loop. Then you have nested commands then you can basically use one of the higher level commands, and you go into an inner command loop which then shows only the sub-commands available to you. And of course you also have help available in each of these, and you can exit the loop, go to the next higher, or get out of it completely. And that is what I call the series of main loops you have. And another possibility is, let's say you have something, I want to remove now an alias. I have what I call a mini loop where the arguments of a command are the commands for this command loops, and you can then define them. In this case, the name of a command is foo, and yeah, in this case I jumped. In this case I triggered the validation which I can associate with each argument, option, and so on. And it told me, okay, the foo you are trying to set, the alias you are trying to remove, that is not an alias, so you can't. And I am already out of the loop otherwise. And lastly, you can also associate interaction with each specific parameter, which can be an input or an option. And at that point, if you are forgetting to set this argument or this option, then you will be interactively asked for the value. And that also uses line noise, but at that point it is not really a command loop anymore, more a loop where it repeatedly asks for the value until you give it one. Yeah, and that covers this slide essentially. And at this point I would like to go into a series of small examples which show roughly how the domain, how this language looks like for defining commands. And at the top level we basically create a new object where we have a big specification which I removed from the example here to make it short. And to execute, to pass the command line, you then simply call the object and tell it do this on the command line, and it will then pass the specification as needed and start doing things. And the commands I showed here, that was called Alias for alias management, which was something in the Staccato application, not directly in the Commander framework. And this is basically the definition of a high-level command with sub-commands. I call this officers. They can do many commands, and they delegate to either other officers or the leave commands, which are then called privates. And this, in the specification place, that is where you then define all the other commands. And that for a private, which is a leave command, that then looks similar. You have the description, you have specification, and you define the callback, the command to execute when all the arguments are set and chosen. And a main point which I make more in the paper is that most of the specification is usually not something you need. There are lots of defaults which make sense, or are, yeah. And in this case now for the alias add command, for example, we have one argument, a standard argument, which is the name of the new alias. And here you see that there's a validation type associated with it, which basically checks, is that a command or not, and it should not be an existing command, so you can't overwrite an existing command with an alias in this specific application. And here you also see that there are lots of things in the defaults. Basically, this argument takes a single value instead of a list, and it's a mandatory argument. It's not optional. The default for this is the empty string. I haven't set any notifications to tell me when the framework does something with a value. So this can be pretty short for simple cases, and for the complex cases you have lots of commands to set, well, all the complex stuff you want to need, and which I have described in more detail in the paper than itself, and I don't really want to go into this much detail here in the talk. And input is what I call a standard argument, which you see on the command line, which is specified in order, and while it has a name here, it doesn't really have a name on the command line itself. And the alternative to that is then the option, which is a named argument, and you specify on the command line with a standard thing like dash, in this case dash debug, for example. And if it's a single character, it is then dash D or something like that. And here you see a bit more of what you can do, like I mark it as undocumented so that it should be excluded from the help. It should also be excluded from command line completion if you don't know about it. That is apparently there's something not quite right. And this is also marked, this is a list. So if you specify multiple debug options, the values accumulate. There's for a single value, always the last value would have been taken and left. And it has a validation type, and the call at v type, that is actually some staccato specific shortcut. It knows the debug validation type lives in the package staccato validate debug, and I have wrapped this into a small procedure to generate the lambda for this, so that I don't have to remember all this stuff. And there is also one of the notification callbacks. Basically, when complete means when the internal representation for the option is generated from the set string representation, then do this, and in this case I directly go into the manager stuff for all the debug stuff and set all the flags which the user has specified. And at that point the backend, the workers command, doesn't have to care about this anymore. And the last of the possible parameters is something which the user of the application you are defining it for shouldn't really see. I call this state, and it's hidden. You don't see it on the command line. It can be used then for interesting stuff. In this case, for example, the generate callback is semi-abused. Instead of returning the value for the argument, it is just used to check if some condition is met, and if yes, then it returns successfully. The value, as I said, is then ignored. Or if the condition is not met, it throws an error, and at that point processing is aborted. So that is stuff I want to have quite early, which is also why it's marked immediate. And that is not really an argument the user should see. And so that is hidden. And the description in this case, given that it is hidden, it is also not in the help. In this case, the description is more internal documentation of what I intend with the thing to do. Another way I am using this type of thing is, for example, in the help system of Commander, where the various formats, they are options, dash for full, dash list, dash short, and so on. And I want to have only the last of these, so I use a hidden state, and each of the options basically sets I was used into this state, and the last used is kept in the state, and the backend just queries the hidden state for the last option in use, and instead of trying to figure it out from the flags themselves. And for the really large example, you will have to look into the Staccato command line client, which is on GitHub, and in this case in the version 2 branch, where you have lots of complex stuff which I put in, like lots of notifications into various managers, so that the command implementations themselves have the information directly available to them instead of looking into the past command line. They do stuff like, what is, host parameter checking, what I mentioned before, this option excludes the other option and the other option excludes this, or options versus arguments, stuff like that. I already demonstrated the stuff about the checks you can put into the declaration. And of course, there are custom validation types. I only touched here on validation types a bit in the, where was it? In the input where I checked that I don't overwrite, for example, a command. And Commander has standard validation types which are basic, like Boolean, file path, string, which is basically pass any integer, stuff like that. And in Staccato I have then lots of other custom types, like is this a route name, is this an application name, or is it not an application name, stuff like that. And in Staccato also I make this use of the standard use is that you have a big static description of your command line API. However, in the core, it can be extended dynamically. You can basically tell the foo, where is it, in the outline. You can tell the foo thing, foo learn this other thing dynamically, and it extends the internal data structures with additional definitions. And that is something I use then for the aliases in the Staccato command, basically. What? S, L. And here you see the aliases I defined in Staccato for this demonstration. For example, the AL that I used is actually the shortcut for aliases and for other and various other commands. And this is based on this commander core ability to dynamically extend the command tree. And this is actually something I'm sort of thinking about, that a bit more of that could possibly put into the Commander framework itself. It is actually something useful to many other applications possibly. So, a bit of the internals. Basically, we have the main classes are the officer class. 10 minutes. Yeah, okay. The officer and the private classes which handle the commands, and the shared common behavior is in the actor base class. And the private then contains a configuration object which contains all the parameters. And at runtime, then the command line is passed, the information is basically put into the parameters. And in the callbacks, you have seen like the when complete, when set, or the generate. They have the parameter as an argument, and through the parameter they can refer back to the config and then the other parameters, so you have access to the whole thing and can cross-check whatever you need or want. And the command callback you saw in the example for the alias private, that gets the configuration object as the one argument it needs, and from there it can then pull all the information out. And in terms of packages, that is basically the same. We have officer, private, and so on. We have the basic help package, which defines all the standard formats, and the other two help packages basically put their main command into the proper namespaces, at which point the main package, the commander help package, will pick the format up automatically. Similar, we have the standard validation types and a utility package for the common parts of validation types. These utilities are then for you for something in your, when you write your own custom validation types, that you can do the standard stuff in an easy way. And some internal utilities. Yeah, my nearly last slide. You might have seen this immediate keyword in one of the examples, that I have this notion, like with tickle objects, that there is a string representation and the internal representation, and the transitions between them, that is the process I call completion, and the immediate versus deferred chooses the timing of this stuff. Like immediate, it will be done by the framework itself, whereas deferred, it will be done on the first access to the parameter when you try to get the value. And at the time I wrote the parameter, I wasn't sure yet if this distinction is needed or if I can use only immediate or only deferred. And right now I have actually come to the conclusion I have examples for both cases. In this case, the state check here is definitely something where I need immediate. And for other stuff like the help system, where I used the same state as the place to store the information about the options, that is something where I don't really need immediate, but deferred. So this is actually a question which is resolved in my mind. I need it. And another thing, global options. Right now, options, if you have lots of options in one option or a few in lots of commands like --debug, which you want in all commands, you have to use the facilities commander for code sharing, which I call common blocks, which are named. And an alternative would be to have something like global options, so that you really define them only once and the system knows them only once and can associate them with any commands in all places. So that is definitely something which has been asked for, again, for the staccato client. Boolean and presence. This is more explained in the paper itself. That is the Boolean validation type, and the framework has some special stuff to recognize that options of this type may not have a Boolean argument, but nothing, or the special forms like if you define the argument foo, then it automatically defines for you the no foo complement and stuff like that. And this is currently hardwired. At the moment you create, let's say, a Boolean validation type of your own, all this hardwired stuff will not work. So that is where I'm thinking, can I put this into the validation type so that I don't have to hardwire it? For this I currently have no real solution, so it is only musing and thinking. What is more possible is going to the validation type and generalize them a bit, like instead of having just all integers, now integer ranges. Will would call this subtypes in his SNIT validation types, where I lifted the concept from. And other stuff would be, right now, I mentioned that there is the ability to ask for a value interactively for a specific argument, and this is currently also very fixed and very simple, like the value is a string, and the most you can do is ask for multiple strings for lists. And there I'm thinking if this is also something which could possibly put into the validation type as an override if you need custom interaction, like you know what values were possible, and then you can, let's say, make a text menu where you can select what you want. And on the front of help, I have, for the integrated help, the formats we have are pretty much what is needed and enough for that. And the --JSON is very good to interact with some external system and get whatever other format you need. I'm still tempted to put in a doctools format for easy integration into Tickle-based systems, so that I can use the tools I have in Tickle to process them directly instead of having to convert from JSON to stuff like that. And another thing on the help, which is more a very small thing, is the help is more reference style. It follows the command hierarchy. So you can say help on all commands, help on this command, or help on this command and its subcommand, and so on. And I'm thinking that it might be useful to have logical sections and which do not follow the direct hierarchy, but rather something like these are the regular commands. These are the more advanced commands, stuff like that. So methods is more directed at the user and not reference style. And last, you can find the code for this framework on the USB stick. You can find it on Cortical in a fossil repository. You have a mirror on Chisel app, which is a fossil hosting site, currently managed by Roy Keane, who is in the back of our room. And some of the other things which support stuff is like the Linux utilities and vertical Linux binding and Linux itself. That is also on GitHub and Chisel Up and various places, and also on the USB stick. So, and at this point, I have all my slides and I could take questions.
I'm missing the sergeants in your hierarchy. You have officers, you have privates, you don't have sergeants in your hierarchy.
Yeah, sergeants are officers. Officers have many commands and delegate. Privates know only one thing and do it. Any other questions? No? Okay. Good. And I believe the next talk is then Roy about public key interfaces, PKI.